Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
My brother leaned across our mother's dining table at the end of a long, noisy evening and, with that practiced half-laugh he saves for me, said that I would never succeed like him, and I felt every old bruise that line carries. The years of being the helper and the backup singer, and the one who cleans up the dishes while he takes bows. But I did not give him the scene he wanted. I just smiled, let the silence hang, and decided that if he needed an audience to feel big, then I would stop being his audience and become his consequence instead. You know that feeling when a comment is not just a comment, but a summary of a lifetime, when it drags up holidays where I picked up the check because he had a cash flow hiccup, or the time I sat in a bank office and quietly co-signed a small line of credit because the loan officer needed to see family faith, or the nights I fixed his pitch deck while he bragged about being self-made. The line he tossed at me that night was not about that night at all. It was about every time he rewrote the story, so that my part disappeared, and I realized I had been propping up a version of him that he used to push me down. I do operations work, nothing flashy and not the kind of job that gets you applause at a family party, but it means I live inside balance sheets and vendor calendars and the small, boring details that keep companies alive. And over the past year, I kept seeing little signals in his business that did not match the chest-thumping he brought to Sunday dinners, the stretched payables, the vendor who called me because he could not reach his controller, the whispers about a lead investor who wanted out if performance did not improve by the quarter. I did not plan anything dramatic. I just paid attention, and that attention turned into a map. When I got home after the party, I made tea I did not drink, opened my laptop, and started pulling on threads I had quietly laid months ago. The email chain with a supplier I used to manage who now held crucial inventory for my brother's largest client. The notes from a call with a mutual banker who had been uneasy about a concentration risk in his receivables. The contact card for an investor I knew from a turnaround I handled 2 years ago who once told me, very plainly, that he preferred adults who do the work over men who perform success. I wrote down what I knew, what I could verify, and what I needed to confirm, and it looked less like revenge and more like a checklist for a rescue that did not need to include him. Here is the part one have never told anyone in the family because they would not hear it without turning it into gossip. Years ago, when he was still the charming underdog, I signed a limited guarantee on that small revolving line. Not because I believed he was a genius, but because I believed his employees did not deserve to miss payroll if a client paid late, and I kept that signature in place long after he learned to pretend I had never been in the room. So the very first thing I did that night, with the calm you get when a decision finally clicks into place, was write a clear, polite message to the banker stating that I was withdrawing my guarantee effective immediately. And I copied my attorney for process and timelines and asked for written confirmation of receipt, knowing exactly what happens at a conservative bank when a guarantor steps away. Then I made a second move that was not loud but carried weight where it mattered. I sent a short note to the investor I respected, not snide, not gossipy, just a straight update that a solvency review might be wise given market headwinds, and that if they were considering options I would be open to discussing an operational control plan with fresh capital, because while I did not intend to blow up his world for sport, I was also done pretending that his world was the only one that counted. And if a better steward needed to step in, I was willing to be that steward. The next morning my phone buzzed with a cheerful group text from my brother about a supposed new client that would change everything, the kind of message written for applause emojis he thinks are currency, and I said nothing. Because the applause he craves has never once paid a bill, and by mid-afternoon the banker called me back to acknowledge my withdrawal and explain that the facility would be reviewed and covenants tested, which is polite banking language for this is going to hurt. And I closed my eyes for a moment and let the guilt rise and pass, because guilt is what kept me small, and small is where he wanted me. I know someone will ask whether pulling that guarantee was cruel, and the answer is that it was honest. It handed back responsibility to the person who wanted the credit, and if that responsibility felt heavy, he could put down the microphone and pick up the work, and while the review clock started ticking at the bank, I booked a quiet lunch with the investor for early the following week and lined up a call with the supplier to discuss contingency plans that would protect the end client and the jobs that actually matter. By the end of that day, I had taken exactly 2 actions, both legal, both simple, both sharp enough to be felt, and I was not crowing about it to anyone, not posting, not parading. Just moving pieces he never noticed, because he never believed I knew how to move them, and when my brother finally called near evening, my screen lit up with his name, and I let it ring until it stopped. Then I opened my calendar, confirmed the lunch, and told myself, very quietly, that the next time he wanted an audience he could buy a ticket, because the show had changed and I was no longer clapping. And here is the hook you are waiting for, because I know you want the moment when talk turns into impact. Before I went to bed, I forwarded a single email thread to my lawyer and added one sentence that changed the tone of everything that would follow. A simple request to prepare the paperwork for an offer that would keep the company alive without my brother at the wheel. And as I turned off the light, I realized something almost funny in its simplicity, that he had given me the fuel I needed by saying out loud what he had always believed. And that next week, when a banker began asking him for fresh collateral he did not have, I would be the calm option in the room, the person with a plan, the person he never saw coming. And if you are wondering whether I hesitated, I did not, because this is not a story about cruelty. This is a story about finally letting actions speak, and mine had just begun. The morning after I pulled my name off that revolving line and set the meeting with the investor, I woke up with the kind of quiet focus you get when a decision stops being a thought exercise and turns into a plan you can pick up with your hands. Because while my brother filled rooms with opinions and stories about how he alone carried weight, I had spent years carrying actual weight for other people's companies, and that experience had taught me that power usually sits in places no one applauds, in clauses and calendars and inventory allocations, and in who signs first and who signs last. So I began by mapping the parts of his business that could either collapse under him or hold steady under me, and I made the calls that would make the difference. I started with the supplier who once reported to me in a previous role and now controlled the single component that his biggest client required on a fixed cadence, a meticulous operations lead named Talia who remembers everything and forgets nothing. And I said plainly that a disruption was possible in the next few weeks because banking covenants would be tested and cash timing could tighten, and I asked that she prepare, purely as a contingency, a short allocation letter reserving a defined weekly quantity under my newly formed entity, a clean special-purpose vehicle with a boring name that no one would notice until it mattered, to be activated only if invoices aged past the grace period or if a control event occurred. Which is a mouthful that means if leadership changed in a formal way, and I made it clear that I was not trying to starve his team, I was trying to make sure the client did not get starved and that the people on the floor did not miss paychecks, because 2 men in suits wanted to posture about pride. Next, I walked into a lunch with the investor who had always valued competence over noise, and over a plate I barely touched we went through the numbers he had, the numbers I had, and the behavior we were both seeing from my brother. And when I laid out a 6-week stabilization plan that protected client deliverables, ring-fenced payroll, and cut vanity spend that served no one, he listened without interrupting except to ask for the name of the payroll vendor and the terms of the office lease. And when I answered with dates and clauses because I had already read the contracts, he nodded once and said the only sentence I needed to hear, that if he moved, he would move only with control and only with me in the chair, and that he would expect a clean, orderly transition that did not set fire to what still worked, and I said that was the only move I would sign my name to. After lunch, I called a lawyer who dislikes drama and loves checklists, and I asked her to draft retention letters for 3 people I knew were the spine of the place, a finance lead named Miguel who could close a month under pressure, a client success lead named Priya who could calm any storm on the account side, and a plant supervisor named Renee who had the respect of every technician, and I made those offers contingent on a change at the top. No solicitation before then, no shortcuts. Just a guarantee that when the moment came they would not be left twisting, because 2 siblings had a history they never asked to be part of. Then I asked for one more document. A straightforward letter of intent ready for signature that signaled to the bank and the investor that I would accept operational control with fresh capital, contingent again on my brother stepping aside. At home, my mother called with the kind of careful tone she uses when she wants me to forgive something without saying that word, telling me that my brother had sounded stressed and that maybe I should check on him because family matters more than business. And I said that I agreed family matters, which is exactly why I was done playing the role that let him treat me like a safety net while he jumped off roofs for applause, and I could hear her disappointment, and I held it without arguing. Because I was not looking for permission anymore. By late afternoon, the bank emailed him a polite request for updated collateral schedules and a covenant attestation, which would not have rattled a disciplined operator, but would rattle a man who relies on momentum and charm. And I did not need to see his face to know he was pacing, because the tone of his group text shifted from victory lap to vague motivational quotes about resilience and winners refusing to quit, which is exactly the moment I sent a short, calm note to his largest client. Not to spook them, not to gossip, simply to propose a performance assurance rider naming my entity as a ready contingency vendor, triggered only by a service disruption longer than 48 hours, because clients do not care about sibling drama. They care about product arriving when promised, and I intended to be the person who made that happen. And then, because revenge only feels satisfying when it is also responsible, I filed the papers to register that quiet entity in the state where his contract law would be enforced. I opened an escrow account that could fund critical purchases without delay, and I signed the letter of intent the Investors' Council turned in record time, after which I forwarded a copy, through my attorney, to the bank officer who had just placed his facility under review, and while I did not send my brother a single word, I did one last thing before shutting the laptop. I transmitted the allocation letter to Talia with a start date aligned to his invoice grace period, which meant that if he kept the music playing, nothing would change. But if he stumbled and tried to bluff his way through, the parts his client needed would route through me, and when my phone lit up with his name again, I watched it ring until it stopped and thought, with a steadiness I had not felt in years, that the next time he reached for leverage, he would find my hands already on it. When the bank's request for updated collateral schedules landed like a polite hammer and his group chat turned from victory laps into vague speeches about resilience and grit, I understood that the performance was finally meeting the paperwork, which meant that timing rather than volume would decide the outcome, so I spent that day doing what he never learned to do, which is to move quietly through the places where decisions are actually made, and I began with the only leverage that matters. When charm runs out, the senior debt that keeps a business breathing. Banks do not like noise. Banks like certainty, and the moment a guarantor steps away and a borrower starts posting slogans instead of numbers, a risk committee somewhere begins wondering whether a clean exit would look wiser than a messy workout. And, because I have sat in rooms where those decisions get shaped, I assembled a proposal that spoke fluent bank, a two-step structure in which the investor funds a special purpose vehicle to acquire the note at a modest discount, the bank gets a swift and face-saving resolution, and the company gets a forbearance path that preserves value only if a new operator steps in with real controls, which was my way of saying that jobs and clients could be protected without continuing to subsidize his pride. While counsel traded drafts and schedules in the background, I turned to the other place where calm leverage lives, the client contract that formed the spine of his revenue. And I asked the end client's legal team for a brief conversation that did not mention family or drama, only continuity, where I laid out a practical contingency they could sign today and file away. A simple novation clause keyed to a change in control or a lender enforcement event, assuring them that their deliveries would continue without a hiccup, that their technical contacts would remain the same, and that the only thing they would notice was a new name on the remittance line. And when the general counsel said she appreciated adults who come with solutions rather than stories, I knew the ground was shifting exactly as planned. He was moving too, but in the way that people move when they are improvising, calling a private lender who quotes ugly rates with even uglier covenants, reaching out to acquaintances to ask for bridge money while spinning a tale about a temporary headwind. And I could feel the shape of those conversations through the industry air, the way a rumor drifts against your cheek before the rain starts. Yet I did not gloat or push. I simply tightened my own plan, asking my lawyer to finalize retention packages with effective dates tied only to a formal transition, arranging a payroll trust that would unlock the moment I held control so that technicians would never wonder whether Friday would arrive empty, and instructing the investors team to keep every document scrubbed of anything that could look like a grudge, because the only way this holds under scrutiny is if it is undeniably about competence. My mother called again and urged me to be the bigger person, which in our house has always meant the quieter person, and she talked about how family should not let money come between them, which sounded noble and also exactly like the script that kept me underwriting his risks while he took Bo's. So I told her with a softness she did not expect that I was being the bigger person by protecting the people who depended on his promises, and that I would not be stepping in as his sister. I would be stepping in as the operator who could keep those promises, and she went quiet in that long way that means she thinks I am being cold, but what she calls cold I call responsible. Late that afternoon, the bank's counsel requested one additional representation about environmental compliance at the plant, which told me they were already preparing the files for committee. And by evening my attorney forwarded a red line of the assignment agreement that only changes hands when a sale is imminent. And I stood in my kitchen reading clauses while my phone flashed with another group text where my brother posted a picture of a whiteboard full of arrows and adjectives that were supposed to reassure everyone that vision would carry the day, and I felt a wave of sadness for the version of him that might have chosen substance over theater, and then I let it pass, because feelings do not move wire transfers. The investor called just before night and said the sentence I had been waiting to hear, that his fund would wire at opening if the bank accepted our final terms, and that he expected me, in exchange, to execute the forbearance the same day and present my brother with a simple choice written in clean language. Either step aside with dignity and a fair separation or face an immediate enforcement that would leave him with far less control over the narrative he cares so much about, and I said I would do exactly that, and that I would do it without spectacle, because the point here was to keep the lights on, not to humiliate a man who has humiliated himself plenty. An hour later my lawyer's email arrived with the subject line that turns a plan into a fact: the bank's acceptance conditioned on signatures in the morning and a quiet close by midday. And as I read it I thought about the first time he asked me to look at a spreadsheet and then bragged the next day about how he alone had saved the deal, and how I said nothing because I did not need applause to know my worth, and I realized I still do not. I only need the authority to do the work properly, which is why I shut down the kitchen light, put the signed instructions in my bag, and set my alarm, because in the morning, if nothing moved off track, I would not be the person he dismissed at a dinner table. I would be his lender walking in with a forbearance that keeps his people paid only if he hands me the keys, and the only open question, the one that would be decided face to face, was whether he would read the document all the way to the end before he understood what had already happened. Morning arrived with the kind of quiet that tells you the noise will start only after ink hits paper, so I dressed like any other weekday, carried a folder that looked like any other folder, and walked into a bank conference room where a junior counsel arranged bottled water no one would drink, and an associate slid signature pages across a table that had seen 100 deals with louder men, and while the ritual felt ordinary the substance was not, because the assignment of the senior note from the bank to the investor's vehicle turned a polite relationship into a decisive one, and the forbearance agreement drafted in clean, unemotional clauses gave me the single lever that empty speeches cannot move. A short window of breathing room for the company if and only if operational control shifted today, which meant that I would not be asking for respect, I would be offering solvency with conditions attached. The bank officers were the definition of professional detachment as they confirmed receipt of the wire and stamped the assignment complete, and the investor nodded in that small way people do when a plan has traveled from theory to ledger. After which my lawyer slid over the control rider we had built with simple language that even a person shaking with humiliation could follow, a two-step path that allowed my brother to keep a piece of the upside if he stepped aside peacefully and released the kind of claims men love to wave when they are cornered, or face an immediate enforcement under the loan documents that would leave him with whatever the math allowed after fees and damage, and I initialed each page with the calm that comes from knowing you are not bluffing. Then signed the novation letter that the client's counsel had approved the night before, which meant their deliveries would not skip a week no matter how much noise he tried to make. I will not pretend I did not feel the weight of it, because power that is won through work rather than theater always carries weight. So during a short pause, I stepped into the hallway and looked at the mundane carpet while my lawyer confirmed that the payroll trust had cleared and the retention letters for Miguel and Priya and Renee were filed with effective times that would trigger only when the ink on the control agreement dried, and I let myself feel both the relief of having the essentials protected and the ache of knowing that my mother would hear about this in a version that casts me as the villain who did not pick up the phone. Then I tucked the ache away because none of those feelings would keep people paid by Friday. Back in the room, we moved through final checks, and when the investor asked me to confirm in front of counsel that I would run a conservative first quarter focused on cash generation and client stability rather than headlines, I said yes without caveat. Because headlines are exactly how we got here, and with that the assignment was closed, the forbearance was executed, and the contingency supply letter slid from contingency to live, which meant that trucks would move without a hiccup and that the end client would never need to care about the family drama now swirling like a rumor in a small town. And as we gathered the signed sets, the investor handed me a slim envelope and told me that it contained a clean notice of control change, a short letter to employees explaining the transition without blame, and a separation agreement for my brother that would let him leave with dignity if dignity was still something he wanted. I took a breath I had been holding for years and thanked the room for their speed, then walked out with the envelope like it was nothing more than mail, and in the elevator I let myself smile at the thought that he once told me that real moves require showmanship. Because the only showmanship here was that no one outside this building had any idea that the ground had shifted under their feet while they were still posting about winning, and I checked my phone and saw a string of messages from him that started confident and slid into strained cheerleading, with one that asked if I could spare a minute to look at a cash timing issue, because I have always been good with details. And I stared at that line until the elevator dinged and the doors parted, and I stepped into a lobby where no one knew that a long story had just turned. On the sidewalk, I called the client's general counsel and confirmed that the novation notice would be delivered within the hour, and that my first act would be to meet their operations lead to review the next 6 weeks of scheduling so that no one would feel nervous about a single date, and I called Talia to confirm the release of components under the new remittance instructions, and I texted my mother a simple note saying that I was busy and safe and would call later, which I knew would not satisfy her but would buy me enough space to finish this day the right way. Then I headed to his office with a courier trailing behind me carrying boxes of clean packets for signatures, which sounds theatrical but is only practical when you want no excuses about missing pages. Security buzzed me up without a question because my name still sits in too many vendor files, and because I always moved through this building like furniture. And as I reached the glass door and saw him laughing with a junior associate in the tone he uses when he needs to feel tall, I felt a crisp steadiness settle in my chest, opened the door, and watched his face brighten in surprise before he could hide the flicker of worry. Then I held up the envelope and asked if he had a private conference room we could use for a few minutes, because I had documents that required his signature today, and as he reached for the handle with a smile that did not reach his eyes, I knew this next part would be the moment he finally heard every word he has ignored for years written in a language he could not spin, and the only question left, the one I carried into that room with the papers that moved the ground, was whether he would choose the path that saved his pride a little or the one that let me teach him what consequences sound like when they read from a signed page. He led me into the small glass room he uses to impress visitors, and, with that same rehearsed ease that has always worked on people who mistake volume for authority, he asked whether this was about the little banking hiccup and whether I could take a quick look at a spreadsheet like old times, and I set the envelope on the table, slid out the notice of control change, the forbearance with its clean conditions, and the separation agreement that kept a sliver of upside if he chose to leave with grace, then told him in a tone I save for situations that need a grown-up that this was not a debate about respect or family dynamics. This was a simple business fork where one path preserved jobs, clients, and a portion of his pride, while the other path unlocked enforcement that would treat him like any borrower who burns time with slogans instead of numbers. He reached for charm first, the familiar cadence about resilience and vision, and the way winners are tested. Then he tried indignation, accusing me of scheming and betrayal and weaponizing knowledge that he believes I only have because he once let me sit in the room, and when that did not move the paper he tried negotiation, asking whether I could loosen the writer, delay the notice, or at least promise that he would remain the face of the company while I did the boring parts, and I kept my hands folded and my voice level as I explained, in sentences that named dates and clauses without a single insult, that the senior note had already moved, that the client novation had already been countersigned, that the supplier allocation would follow remittance instructions tied to my entity, and that the payroll trust would fund on my signature only, which meant the only decision left for him was whether he wanted his exit to be quiet and compensated or noisy and expensive. He called our mother from the room, put her on speaker, and tried to draft her into an argument about loyalty and gratitude, because he cannot imagine a world where the person who cleaned up the mess stops cleaning. And I told her gently that I would call later because I was in a meeting, and I could hear the hurt in her breath even as I reminded myself that this conversation was not about love or approval, but about responsibility I had already accepted. So I pressed the separation agreement back across the table and gave him time, because people need a beat to grieve the story they have told about themselves. I wish I could say he signed then and there, but he did the thing men like him do when they feel the room slip. He tried to flip the table with a threat to walk into the bullpen and rally the team against me, which is when I took out the short letter to employees. The one that explains in practical language that the company is stable, that deliveries continue, that payroll is protected, and that operational leadership has changed in order to meet obligations with the discipline clients deserve. And I told him that if he stepped into the bullpen now, he would be greeted by a calm announcement from me and retention letters for the 3 people who hold the building up, and that after that announcement his access to systems would be turned off by the controller on the conclusion of my brief remarks, because while he loves a scene, stability loves a plan. He stared at the envelope for a long time, then signed his name on the separation line with the heavy hand of a man writing a word he never thought he would have to write, asked for a photocopy, and tried a last attempt at saving face by saying he was choosing to take a strategic pause, which I allowed him to say because sometimes dignity is a negotiable instrument and I am not out to bankrupt anyone's supply of it. Then I thanked him for the years he had put into building a sales pipeline that still has bones worth saving, asked if he preferred to pack his desk now or at day's end, and watched the sentence land like a sober bell because he finally understood that this was not theater and that the part where he leaves was not a suggestion. He packed slowly, placing a framed photo into a cardboard box the way people do when they are counting witnesses, and I stood where everyone could see me without having to guess at my expression. Then I gathered the floor a minute later and spoke in the plain voice I promised the investor I would use, explaining that the work continues, that the clients will see zero disruption, that anyone who has spent nights keeping this place alive has a future here, and that we will run on data rather than noise, after which I released the retention letters, confirmed the payroll schedule, and invited questions that were practical in the way questions become when people realize the sky is not falling. When the elevator doors closed on him and the small box that held the last props of his role, I felt the sadness you are supposed to feel when you end something that used to hold possibility, and I let it pass through without dramatics. Then I walked back to the glass room, signed the first work orders under the new letterhead, called the client to say that I would be on their site tomorrow to walk the line and hear their concerns without a filter, and finally called our mother to tell her that I understood why this would be hard to hear, that I would not smear him or parade a victory, and that the story I am writing from here is not a revenge saga, but a plain promise to run this company like it should have been run all along. If you want to know whether I regret the way I played this, I will tell you what I told the investor after the first trucks rolled under my signature and the plant ran through second shift without a hiccup, that there is a difference between cruelty and consequence, that I did not humiliate a man so much as stop underwriting his fantasy, and that when people ask why I smiled at that party while he smirked and measured himself in applause, the answer is simple and not poetic at all, because within a week I walked into a room with papers that mattered. I signed my name where it counted, and I watched him pack his desk while the work he took for granted kept moving, which is exactly the kind of ending I can live with.